Hi folks, welcome to the first in a series of tutorial videos for our PA-38 Tomahawk in Microsoft Flight Simulator. This tutorial series will be split into 3 parts, with each part covering a different portion of the flight. This first part will be covering the pre-flight inspections, walk around and engine start. The flight we will be completing this series is Liverpool John Lennon Airport on the west coast of England to Humberside Airport on the east coast. This 110-mile route should take approximately 1 hour to complete and will give us a good opportunity to explore the Tomahawk's many features and to practice the aircraft's operating procedures. We start our flight today parked on an apron at the east side of Liverpool John Lennon Airport, an apron that will be used by the airport's flying school that operated the very aircraft used in this tutorial flight. As we have loaded the flight at a parking space, the aircraft has loaded in a cool and dark state, with electrical power off, engine shut down, and external equipment like chocks and tie-downs fitted. The first step to getting the Tomahawk ready for flight is to open the doors to allow entry into the cockpit. We can do this by clicking on the overhead latch, followed by the lower door latches, and then click on the red leather armrests to push the doors open. We can now start working through the pre-flight checks. To enable easier access to the controls, you may wish to hide the yoke by clicking on the click spot at the base of the yoke. On the lower instrument panel, ensure that the ignition switch is set to off, and switch on both the battery and alternator switches. With the battery supplying electrical power to the aircraft, we only have a finite amount of time before the battery drains, so we must ensure that the battery is only ever switched on when absolutely necessary prior to engine start, and that it isn't switched on for any extended period of time. Whilst the aircraft has electrical power, check that both fuel quantity gauges on the control quadrant show full tanks, and confirm that the alternator warning light at the top of the instrument panel is illuminated. Once these checks are complete, switch off both the battery and alternator switches. With the yoke, confirm full and free movement of the flight control surfaces and visually confirm proper operation. Note that due to the friction between the nose wheel and the ground, movement of the rudder will not be possible when the aircraft is stationary. Forceful movement of the rudder pedals may result in damage to the nose wheel steering system. We can now also perform an extension and retraction of the flaps to confirm their proper operation. Moving across to the AFB on the right side of the instrument panel, open the aircraft app. This app has a variety of options that are available to you to fully customize your Tomahawk experience. We will be covering a few of these options throughout this tutorial series. For now, let's enable the co-pilot by clicking the button at the bottom left corner of this page. Having a co-pilot on board will make our lives a little bit easier during this tutorial flight, as we will have an equal weight distribution on both sides of the aircraft, meaning that the aircraft will have less of a tendency to roll to one side during a flight. We can confirm that the parking brake is on, and with the cockpit checks complete, we can now move to the exterior of the aircraft to complete our pre-flight walkaround. To do this, go to the aircraft page on the AFB and press the Start Walkaround button. A menu will now open showing a top-down view of the aircraft and various camera angles that will represent each point on the walkaround. The walkaround is to be conducted in a clockwise direction, starting at a point on the aft side of the left wing. So to begin this walkaround, click the camera icon immediately behind the left wing. The camera and AFB will now move to the exterior of the aircraft. On the AFB we can see that there are 3 checks to be completed at this position. The first is to check the condition and operation of the ailerons, so we can left click on the aileron to move it fully up and down to check for proper operation and check for any visual defects. A second menu on the aileron page allows you to manually adjust the aileron trim so the aircraft flies straight and level regardless of how many pilots are on board. As we have 2 pilots aboard today, we have equal weight distribution, so we do not need to adjust the aileron trim. As the aileron has passed its pre-flight checks, a green tick will appear next to the item on the AFB, and we can now move on to the next item. If the aileron were to fail the pre-flight check, a red cross will appear next to the item on the AFB, and information regarding the fault will be displayed in the info box on the right side of the AFB. If a fault exists, it must be repaired before we conduct our flight. We can repair the fault by pressing the repair button, and once repaired, the component will show a green tick on the AFB and we can move on to check the next item. We can continue conducting the remainder of the walkaround using the controls on the AFB to move to the next area. At each position we can use the check all button to quickly check all components at that position. If any of the items had a red cross after a check all, then we can press the fix all button to fix all of the broken items. It is worth noting that the fix all button will only fix the items that are required to be fixed. It will not affect any of the component wear on the components that do not need fixing. Once the walkaround has been complete and we have returned to the starting position, press the return button at the top right corner of the page to return to the cockpit. If for whatever reason you didn't want to complete the walkaround, you can just click the check all and fix all buttons on this page. The check all button on this page will check all items at all positions on the walkaround, and the fix all button will fix all broken components on the entirety of the walkaround. Note, like previously, the fix all button only fixes the items that require fixing, and it won't affect component wear on other components which are otherwise safe for flight. We can now prepare the aircraft for engine start. During the walkaround we should have already removed the chocks and tie downs, but to ensure that this is the case, we can check their status on the aircraft page of the AFB, or we can look behind us to confirm that they are stored in the rear baggage compartment. We can now close the cabin doors by left clicking the red leather armrests, and then rotating the lower door latch, followed by the overhead door latch. On the lower right side of the instrument panel, check that all circuit breakers are pushed in. To the left of the control quadrant, ensure the carburetor heat is switched off. On the control quadrant itself, rotate the fuel selector clockwise one notch to the left position, then move the mixture lever to the fully rich position and advance the throttle lever to approximately 1/4 inch open. As we are starting the aircraft with a cooled engine, we can prime the engine by cycling the primer knob in and out 2 or 4 times depending on the amount of priming required. On the last stroke, leave the primer in the out position. We can now switch on the battery and alternator switches again to provide electrical power to the aircraft and turn on the navigation lights, warning anyone in the area that we are about to start the engine. Switch on the electric fuel pump and confirm that a positive fuel pressure is shown. Rotate the magneto selector to the both position, check that the area surrounding the aircraft is clear of obstructions, and then turn the key to the start position. As the engine splutters into life, push the primer knob in slowly and slightly advance the throttle to keep the engine running. Check that the oil pressure and temperature are rising. On the main instrument panel, confirm that the alternator and starter warning lights have extinguished. Adjust the throttle to maintain approximately 1000 RPM and check that the vacuum gauge indicates 5 inches of mercury plus or minus 0.1. We can now switch off the electric fuel pump and confirm that the fuel pressure falls but is still within the green sector. Rotate the fuel selector switch to the right and then to the left, checking that the engine operates correctly on both tanks before selecting the fullest tank. With the engine now running and the alternator charging the battery, we can now switch on the avionics. Starting at the top of the centre panel and working down, switch on the GMA 340, SL30, SL40 and GTX 328. We now need to configure the avionics for our departure. Using the knob on the director indicator, set the compass chord to ensure that it matches the heading shown on the whiskey compass. Alternatively, use the set heading indicator control assignment, which by default is the D key on your keyboard. We'll be departing from runway 27 today and then briefly flying north up the River Mersey for a short sightseeing trip over the city of Liverpool before making a right turn to fly towards the first nav aid on the route, the Manchester VOR. This VOR is located at Manchester Airport and should provide for some great views of the airport as we pass overhead. In preparation, tune the Manchester VOR into the Nav1 radio by first pressing the Nav button to display the current active and standby nav frequencies, and then using the inner and outer knobs on the right side of the unit, input the frequency into the standby field. Once inputted into the standby field, use the flip-flop button to move the frequency into the active field. With our instruments now set for departure, we can begin our taxi to runway 27 via taxiways Alpha and Golf. Check that the area around the aircraft is clear of obstructions and then release the parking brake. Apply power slowly to get the aircraft rolling and then start the short taxi to the runway. Steering the aircraft with only rudder pedals is generally sufficient, but combined use of the rudder pedals and the brakes permits if tight turns are required. As we make turns during the taxi, check that the operation of the gyroscopic instruments are correct. We can then stop at the holding point just short of runway 27, point the aircraft into the wind, and we can perform our ground checks here. Set the parking brake and advance the throttle lever to obtain 1800 RPM. Switch off the left magneto, ensuring the RPM drop is less than 175 RPM with a maximum difference of 50 RPM, and then switch it back on. We can then repeat this process for the right magneto. Check that the vacuum, oil temperature, oil pressure and ammeter readings are all within limits. Make sure that the mixture lever is still set to fully rich and that the fuel selector is set to the fullest tank. Carry out a carburetor heat check by pulling the carburetor heat lever to on and check for a small drop in RPM. Then push the lever back to off. If the RPM increases to significantly more than the original 1800 RPM, it is likely that icing conditions are present. However, with only a few clouds and moderate temperatures for today's flight, this should not be an issue. Finally, we can reduce the throttle to idle and check for rough running. And that wraps up part 1 of this tutorial series in our PA-38 Tomahawk for Microsoft Flight Simulator. We have the aircraft holding short of the runway with all pre-flight checks completed and the engine started. So with that, we kindly ask you to like this video, subscribe to the channel and share the video if you found it useful. In part 2 of this tutorial series, we will cover takeoff and en route navigation.